Dungeons and Dragons!
Yes, Dungeons and Dragons. A very popular game among enjoyers of pop culture for decades. It's been a while since these two figures from the NECA D&D 1/12 scale line were released, which begs the question, are they still worth it? For newer collectors on the scene, these 12th scale figures are actually based on a D&D toy line from the 1980s from a company called LJN. Zarak? How do you say that? Green Guy was an evil half-orc assassin, and Strongheart was a good paladin. The vintage figures of this line were very toyetic. They had basically 5 points of articulation, plus an additional hinge in the shoulders, and I guess this is technically a ball joint in the hips to allow for more movement. Each came with a single accessory. Strongheart had a sword, all the better to fight evil with, and Zarak had a bright yellow dagger, to be as inconspicuous as possible. But the real question is do the NECA versions of these characters do the LJN ones justice? Well, let's take a look. Oh man, NECA really went ham with the creative license on this one, but not in a bad way. The little feller still stays true to the old LJN inspiration, while also updating the character for, modern collecting and landscape. The box for him is pretty standard for NECA. Nice art on the front, actual photos of the figure on the sides and the back, and look, it also advertises another figure in the line. The box also has that flap on the front to reveal a window that shows the actual figure within. I also want to mention this little note up in the corner. All these NECA D&D figures have it, and it is a great nostalgic callback to the old LJN packaging, which was also in French in Canada, because Canadians are French. Just like his 1980s predecessor, the figure itself is shorter than others in the line thus far. He stands about 6 1/8 inches tall, give or take, including his pointed hood. Weight and build is pretty solid, feels fairly good quality and not cheaply made, which is encouraging. The sculpt is also good. He's got this pattern throughout most of the outfit, which suggests a thick fabric material. All the better to keep him warm on those long winter nights. The paint is not too bad, mostly black with some blue dry brushing and some red accents here and there. The NECA version also has leather coloring and texture on the sashes and belt, where the LJN one was just red. Buckles, buttons, and rivets on the belt and sashes are painted a brassy gold color, and the pouches are tied in nicely with the rest of the figure by a clever red outline. One should note there is some paint bleed in certain areas, but it's nothing too offensive, and when it's up on a shelf, you probably won't see it. That face is something else. He's got 2 heads, one is hooded and one is non-hooded, but they went for this over-the-top creepy vibe in the face sculpt and paint. Looks like someone you'd find lurking around Hot Topic. You can see the inspiration of the LJN one, but that one had more of a Shrek vibe. That goblinish grin is also a welcome choice. He always looks like a cliché supervillain deviously plotting the protagonist's downfall. Zarak comes with a good number of accessories too. He has a small gold-colored sword, 2 small daggers with silver blades and gold and leather handle, as opposed to sunflower yellow. He also has this beaker of mysterious red liquid, which is probably poison or blood or cranberry juice or something. It even has this cork on top, and when held like this, just promotes that supervillain vibe even more. There's also this grappling hook on a rope, which is just a piece of brown yarn. This is another clever nod back to the LJN figure, which did have a coiled rope sculpted on the back of its belt. Now, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this accessory, because on one hand you've got the ability to do very creative poses by wrapping the rope around his hands or having it deployed somewhere perhaps, but on the other hand, it's a bit wavy from the way it comes in the packaging, so it doesn't always sit right, and is an absolute test of patience to coil up. But I definitely don't hate it. In fact, it actually has that toyetic feel that older 3 3/4 inch figures had when their weapons had a string on it. Best part, actually, is this hook on his belt so that he can carry it around when it's not in use. Like I mentioned earlier, he has this unhooded head, and 5 extra hands for some reason. Not sure why we couldn't have rounded this number up to 6, because the odd one out is this gripping hand, which is the only one he can use to hold the sword, beaker, and grappling hook convincingly. I would have liked to have seen a left version of this hand with the figure, because just the one makes him Zarak the evil half-orc right-handed assassin. The pairs of hands he comes with are 2 relaxed hands, 2 fist hands, and 2 loose 2-fingered grip hands, which are supposed to be for the daggers, I guess, but just make him look like he's gently handing them to you instead of threatening your life with them, even more so if you put him in blade first. His articulation is pretty good, I'd say, considering he's a shorter and chunkier figure. The head is on a dumbbell joint, and the neck is also articulated. But none of that really matters in practice because he has this big, massive collar like 16th century royals wore. And it kinda hinders that double joint, where the only thing he can really do while wearing it is move his head side to side. Looking up or down is possible, but it takes the whole collar with it and makes it seem like more of a faux ab crunch. However, you can remove this frilly collar thing and just put the head on without it, which isn't as cursed as I thought it would be, actually. This would be a more suitable look for an assassin trying to blend in somewhere, in my opinion, like in a tavern or a market. Little easier to be forgettable without this massive frilly collar. You could also put the unhooded head on without the collar to give him a off-the-job vibe. Without the collar, he's got pretty good neck articulation. He can look up a good way and down a good way. Or straight forward, I guess, because his eyes are painted looking slightly up on both heads, so you just, feel trapped in the room with him.
Come here.
Arms have a hinge at the shoulder and are connected to what feels like a dumbbell joint inside the torso to bring about a smidge more articulation in the shoulders. The arms also have this awkwardly long double-jointed elbow. My first impression of this is, what is this unholy creation? But after messing with it, it's kinda grown on me, because the fabric wrinkles are molded in a way that disguise it nicely.
I'm in disguise, you stupid tart.
It makes the clothing look more thick and baggy, and actually doesn't look near as bad as I anticipated, even if you just move one of the 2 hinges. Just be careful when you first get the figure, because the upper hinge on the left elbow on mine was really stiff. I got it to move by applying brute force, but that also puts the joint at risk of damage, so just a word of warning. In terms of articulation, the hands are pretty standard, a 360 swivel at the wrist since they're removable, and a hinge as well for up and down movement, though I did find the alternate hands to also suffer from stiff joint syndrome. There is a ball-jointed waist, but for what? Because the plastic of his large shirt is so thick that it renders this joint useless for anything except the swivel. The legs are honestly pretty average articulation. They move forward, but not a whole lot. They move a bit further backwards though, and have pretty decent outwards range. But I've got no clue what circumstance would warrant this gem of a pose. Knees have a decently disguised single hinge joint, and the ankles have a hinge for good backwards and decent forwards movement. And of course that classic ankle pivot for dramatically evil poses. And that about does it for Zarak in the articulation department. My absolute favorite part about this figure is that he can actually carry all his weapon accessories on his person, which is a big deal to me. I love it when you can stack up a figure to carry their extra weapons. It just, feels that much more authentic. The two daggers are a little tight in their sheaths, so just be cautious not to bend or break them when inserting or removing them. They do sit sort of diagonally in there, which isn't the end of the world, but just so you know, that is how they're supposed to look. His beaker of mysterious red liquid would be an exception to this though. Not because it's easier to get into his sheath, but because there isn't a place to put it unless he's holding it in his hand, which isn't a huge loss, but it is noteworthy. Alright, let's talk about Strongheart. This was the figure I was most excited for out of the two, because he's one of my favorite figures in the old LJN line. He comes locked away in a plastic and cardboard coffin conceptually identical to Zarak's, with the real toy photos and artwork and such. Our little evil half-orc right-handed assassin also gets an honorable mention on the back, and that lovely flap and window again so you can actually see what you're buying in stores, and naturally legal gubbins on the bottom. This figure stands about 7.5 inches tall, 8 1/4 if you count his heroic feather on top of the helmet. He too feels pretty sturdy and well made, though he is a little top heavy, which is fair because of the absolute girth going on up here, but overall I've had no issues getting him to stand most of the time. The sculpt on Strongheart is brilliant. It is very detailed, and the subtleties and little tiny details are accentuated even further with dry brushing, weathering, and detail painting. You'll find this molded chainmail texturing on his arms, legs, neck, and the underpart of his armored kilt skirt thing. The NECA version's armor actually looks better and makes more sense than the LJN one. Look at this! Are those veins molded in his arms? Okay, riddle me this, Batman. How is he supposed to bend his elbows with solid cast armor like this? Unless this is spandex or something, which is a different issue, it doesn't seem like this would be very efficient for battle, fighting with permanently straightened arms. Anyways, I digress. The chainmail makes way more sense for this figure, and gives more of a heroic knightly vibe in a medieval sort of way. The gauntlets and hands are nicely sculpted, the boots look like dyed heavy leather, the knee pads have the ornate spikes on the sides keeping true to the LJN ones, and the kilt skirt thing is great too, even held up by a massive belt. The paint apps are basically limited to a weathered steel silver look, except for the torso armor, which is a darker gunmetal-y color. And of course there are two different blues used as accents. One more muted and flat blue for the dyed heavy leather parts, such as the gauntlets and the boots, and a vivid metallic blue for the accentuated metal parts, like the gauntlet armor, the kilt skirt thing, and heroic lion crest on his chest. We'll take a look at his helmet in a moment, but first I'd like to mention this cape. It is a soft goods cape made of a very smooth or soft material. I have no clue what it actually is. I want to say silk, but I'm not really sure. Regardless, the best part is this internal wire that runs along the edges of the entire cape, so it's posable. It can either be draping earthwards, hanging from his shoulders, or it can be waving in the wind behind him, while some narrator spouts some prologue about him being the hero they need or deserve or something. Adds a whole nother dimension to this figure's posability. You can really get some serious heroic poses out of this guy. The face sculpt is good. He's got that classic heroic mustache and bushy eyebrows, just like his 1980s predecessor. Though I can't help but see Basil Fawlty when I look at that face.
Faulty? What's wrong with him?
The helmet is great too. It has ribs and panels throughout that hint to it being hand-forged by some skilled blacksmith/armorer, and it has those wings that protrude from the sides. And of course, you can't forget that fluffy feather on top to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. It's also articulated. The face guard is also posable. and can be folded down over his face when he marches into battle. Just note that you kind of have to force it down a bit to get it lined up properly with his eyes, or else you just see those eyebrows through his visor. The articulation is pretty solid. The head and neck are both articulated, which gave him good up and down movement, and a little side to side, not that a knight would ever do that much. The shoulder bells are a soft plastic that won't hinder movement too much. The shoulders can rotate and extend out with a hinge. Plus there is a bicep swivel that is stiffer than a corpse when you first open the package. Single hinge jointed elbows that can also rotate. The hands can 360 swivel, accompanied by that hinge for up and down motion. I did not find that Strongheart's hand hinges suffered from stiff joint syndrome. He does have an ab crunch joint, but it takes some fiddling to get it to align properly because I always find it kind of drifts to one side. Not entirely sure why. The waist is on a ball joint for added motion, including swivel. The hips are ball jointed with a thigh swivel and can move forward, backwards, and out, but they are limited by his armored kilt skirt thing, which is soft plastic. He has comically long double jointed knees to work around the knee armor, limited swivel in the boot, and that hinge and pivot in each foot. Sir Faulty also has a fair number of accessories as well, the meat and potatoes of which are his sword and scabbard. But they have also added a shield, which the LJN one never had, but could have always used. The scabbard does hang on his belt, but it's a bit dicky. It just loosely fits in this soft, pliable plastic loop and hangs there. It's not awful, I suppose, and I've never had it fall off, but it just seems like an odd choice to me, you know? Though admittedly, it is pretty badass that we can get poses of him drawing or sheathing his sword. He also has this little dagger, which can cleverly fit into its own little sheath on the side of the sword scabbard. Adding this semi-concealed backup weapon was an excellent choice on part of NECA. This is something that a hero would definitely do in case their main weapon was compromised for whatever reason. He's got a bloody great hammer too, which is gold and brown, with a wrist strap. And unlike his evil half-orc right-handed assassin foe, Strongheart comes with 3 pairs of extra hands. He's got 2 open hands, 2 standard grip hands, 2 tight grip hands, and 2 fist hands. They also included this snack packet for later. I'm just joking, don't eat silica gel. If I had to pick a negative about this figure, it would be his inability to carry all his weapons. The sword and dagger can be carried when not in use, but there's nowhere to put the shield unless he's holding it. And the same goes for his bloody great hammer. It would have been nice to see a hook on the back of his belt to hang it from, but it's not a deal breaker. He's still a very solid figure, all in all, I'd say. So, overall, are these good figures? I would say yes. Now, NECA is a company that can make some great toys, but they can also make some really terrible ones. So I'm very glad to see these ones being good. To be perfectly honest, these 4 are actually the best NECA figures I've ever owned. They do have some of the typical NECA problems, such as the more you move the limbs or joints or change out the hands, the looser they get, but for what they are, I would say that they're still good figures. Now, they are in the typical NECA 7-inch scale, but they can scale up good with other toy lines, which does include the Hasbro D&D figures from the 1983 cartoon. You can actually get some pretty good displays out of these with that line. Here is Strongheart and Zarak compared to some Black Series, the SH Figure Arts Indiana Jones, and the McFarlane Zuko. So, if you are a fan of medieval fantasy, Dungeons & Dragons, or even the vintage LJN figures, I would recommend adding these to your collection, or at the very least considering it. They really do keep the cool factor of the vintage 3 3/4 inch ones, while adding a new dimension to the characters for the modern collecting landscape. I really hope they continue this line. We know Elkhorn is coming,
Aye, because I'm a dwarf.
but I would really like to see figures like Ringleron, Kellic, and even more of those classic 80s Dungeons & Dragons characters reimagined in the 6-inch scale.
You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.